We've been having great talk for the last 2 days. The first day was about the two laws, Section 377 and the NASA judgment. Yesterday was a very fantastic panel discussion on co-production. And today we are actually talking about queer identities and something which we are trying to see whether how in India the queer identity, how is it different or similar to queer identities around the world. So we are really privileged to have a very eminent panel and a wonderful moderator, so I'm not going to take up much time.
I'm going to ask all of you, in all your interactions with queer culture in India, across the world, give me some example of an incident where just the bizarreness of it struck you.
I grew up at a time when, before internet and mobile phones and stuff, so your gay identity was completely scavenged. Your gay identity was formed by cutting out underwear ads.
Underwear ads, yes, very important in all our lives.
And stuffing it into a shoebox, and that is what you had. In that space, you were scrounging for identity, and so to be gay meant something different. And people often say, like, oh, you grow up thinking you're the only gay person in the world, which was not true for me. But the frustrating thing was that I knew I was not, but I had no idea how to find any of the other people around there. So I knew. And and the desperation, and I talked about it a little bit yesterday when I was talking about my book, it led to risks that I would never imagine taking right now, like putting my home address in a personal ad in Tricone magazine in the hope of finding other gay people, and then being flooded with letters from my mother saying, like, who do you know in Ludhiana? Why is someone writing you letters from Ludhiana? And 3 years later, people still finding a back issue of the magazine and showing up at your doorstep.
Really, at your doorstep?
Yeah, people would just.
So it was very successful.
It was way too successful, because that was how I ended up getting outed to my family. Yeah. But now in Calcutta today, you go to a gay party at this seedy hotel called Blue Moon, which looks like too many people walk up the stairs are going to collapse. And you go there, and it's a whole new world, because there are people who come from my background, and there are these kids who come from Bongaon or some little town where they've taken a local train to come here, and they've come to the hotel and then changed into sort of a slinky dress-like party outfit, and they are going to have to stay in that party because the last train to Bongaon will leave at 12 midnight, right. And so they have to make that fine decision as to whether they're going to catch that last train, or find somebody here, or stay at this place till 6 a.m. in the morning. And in a way, that wasn't that different from my initial days in San Francisco, where living in a small town without a car, I would come to a bar in San Francisco and have to make that critical determination as to whether I was going to try and go home with some guy at the bar, or I was going to take that last bus home. But within all of that, so there's a lot more diversity and a lot more out there-ness and audacity, which I didn't see while I was growing up. But at the same time, some of the same things are still there. There's still my gay friend who will pick up the married guy who, while having sex with him, is also talking to his wife on the phone about whatever shopping they have to pick up for dinner, and so those things still continue in the same way.
It is very easy, in the language of Kashish, the language that I've seen over the last few days, is very much one of a global unity, and that's terrific, and the solidarity that comes with it is great. But at the same time, sometimes we need to step back and ask, actually, is what the Irish did a weekend ago really relevant in India? Is it a model, or should we actually understand that it was only possible because of certain social and political forces in Ireland that are very different to the social and political forces that exist in other parts of the world?
I think you can frame things within Indian context, and as Dennis was saying, in which you can somehow manage to put the family at the center of it. It's amazing how beautifully accepting we can be. So another friend of ours who happens to be lesbian, and she's the CEO of her own company. When she outed herself to her company, and when she and her wife went back to the company, the factory workers welcomed her with an aarti, with garlands, everything. And you would imagine that outing yourself in a corporate sense is very much about having this Western sense of maybe having policies and things like that. But the way the factory workers and people in the company decided to welcome them was if the CEO of the company would bring a wife home. It's just here it happens to be two women, and they're like, well, we're going to do the same we're going to welcome you in the same way that we would imagine. Not very different from how Kiran Kher in Dostana chooses to understand what initially seems to be an alien thing. She chooses to frame it within a traditional network of ritual and says, this is how I'm choosing to accept. So it's not, I think it's wonderfully bizarre that we can do that.
What has surprised me over the years is the diversity of acceptance and rejection.
And rejection.
Yeah. So you have families. You have a gay boy with his partner being invited by the parents or one member of the couple, telling them that why don't you come over and stay with us in the house? It's too expensive to have another household. In Bombay, it's inexpensive, so you might as well save the money and we can use it for other things.
Right.
And they're staying, and the boy just said that, but you know, my partner is a sister, and it might affect marriage prospects, and people will talk about it. So the gay couple was talking, and the parents said that we'll handle it. That people will always talk. We have to handle this one day or the other. You come and stay with us. And so now they're staying together, and very normally there's no issue about it. To the other extreme, that I've seen parents who are very loving, and the moment they figured out the child was gay, kick them out. So you have this entire extreme. You have people somewhere halfway where one family accepts, the other family doesn't accept. I've seen Satyanarayan Puja being conducted by two men, and you go to the priest and you say, but it will be conducted by two boys. And the guy looks at him and says, but my fee will remain the same.
That's
So that's
When I was covering the elections last year, I was in the middle of Badlands of UP in Sultanpur, and I had this driver who was this young Muslim man. He says, sir, so do you have a girlfriend? And I say, no. And I left it in that. And then I asked him just to be polite, do you? And he said, yeah, you know, and then told me this like star-crossed love story with this richer Muslim girl with whom he had done full everything, all oral and all, but they were not together, and by the end of the thing he's crying while driving on the way. And so I patted him and I'm like, you know, it's okay, it'll be all right. And then I felt like he confessed so much to me, I had to come up with something. So I said, when you asked me this thing, and I'm wondering how far we are from Varanasi, like from. You asked me whether I had a girlfriend, you know, it's true I don't. And then looking straight out and I say, as a matter of fact, I have a boyfriend. And he just got silent and he was like, how, I would never have thought. And then he said, chalo, aapka to koi hai, mera to koi nahi hai. There's like an enormous focus on the singular act of coming out. And that singular act of coming out implies you're in or you're out. And even like very, very supportive television programs, because they want to construct a dramatic narrative around a parent and a child, are focused on the moment the child comes out to the parent. So you stay tuned, you know, don't go away for during the ad break. After we come back, she will come out to the mother. The mother will then have to react to this thing. And in which is all very fine, but does not take into account the fact that there are many other ways of being out. So I have friends whose parents would never acknowledge the partner, introduce the partner as my son's boyfriend, significant other, but their acceptance is shown in other ways. So every time the other boyfriend, this guy comes home and is going home, his mother makes sure to pack the tiffin carrier for the partner. So you know, there are many ways
practical acknowledgement.
that you acknowledge.
It's
But
not literal
acknowledgement.
In terms of coming out, I get worried about this because it assumes that somehow everybody has this essential sexual identity, and if only they would be honest about it, that's it. And as you said, I think several of you said, that's often the script of TV and movies. But actually sexuality is very fluid. Lots of people don't have an essential sexual identity, like the guy you were talking about. I think he may well be someone who, under the right circumstances, could fall in love with a man, as easily as fall in love with a woman. We don't often have the language, and the international queer language somehow denies that possibility, increasingly with its emphasis on coming out and an essential being that somehow has to be discovered.
But Dennis, I want to just ask you, since you wrote the essay from which we've got our panel title from this, have you changed your perspective on whether there is or there isn't a global gay identity? Or I mean, I noticed your newest work is called Death of the the End of the Homosexual.
Yeah. I think I'm probably more conscious now than I was 20 years ago. The possibilities for us are very much shaped by the societies and the cultures in which we live, in which we grow up. I mean, when we've talked, you make references to thousands of years of cultural and religious and spiritual history that is not part of my heritage. And we have things in common, particularly when we bitch and gossip over a lunch table, but at the same time there are some basic cultural differences, and often I think this global language doesn't take enough account of that.
You know, while it's easy to run down the global language and this sort of global mainstream identity, I started off by saying how limiting it is. It can actually give people a language at times. I mean, earlier I talked about an example. This is my example of an interesting. This is about the boyfriend of a friend of ours. Now, my friend is like me. He's fat. He's got a beard. He's older. He's a bear. Okay, and his boyfriend is a bear lover. Now, what I found fascinating about this kid is that he had found this whole language of bear culture, and you know, a lot of bear culture is about language and joking and the terminology, that thing. He had found it all online, and he'd become this whole expert on bear culture online. And then he came and he found himself a bear boyfriend. Now, for him, these sort of global identities was empowering in a certain sense.
I think for us, at least in India, and from here at Kashish, we can look at these global structures as something that we can use effectively when we need be. So speaking from the corporate world, which is where I sit right now, it's very easy. I mean, it would be a much more difficult argument were I to say that this is in our tradition. So if I draw upon Devdutt, it, even as simple as he makes his arguments, it wouldn't fly in the corporate world. So I use for me, it's very...
So what are the arguments?
So I use arguments that I think a lot of us use. We say, the world is increasing global. Do we want to be a global kind of Indian company? So in that, I tap into, your arguments of some years ago, saying that globalization is taking us to a place where we have to conform to certain kinds of things. Then I use another argument of values, of human rights, of things like that, and ultimately I hark back to heritage and say, these values are in fact in our own heritage. But the way I craft the argument is not either local or global. I use elements of both as and when I need be to make my point. So it's very jugaru, but it works. And I think perhaps that's very local about how we solve problems in India in general.
We take parts that work for us.
See, Ruth Sanita made a very nice comment about what is modernity. And she said it is cultures that allow mixing.
Right.
Just anything which allows you to mix things. You see, we have been taught the scientific temper. And in chemistry, we think of periodic tables where every element has its own little box. And people are trying to understand human psychology in the same way. We want things to be boxed in. We want stories to be boxed in. We want cultures to be boxed in. But the human mind resists being boxed. It's just that it is so much more convenient when you have one idea. This whole one way of looking at the world is convenient. But it is not the way. The two human beings have two different points of view, and they create a third point of view between them. And it's something that we don't understand, and it's somewhere, there's a resistance to the idea that human mind is fluid, our stories will be fluid. I think there is one group which wants to universalize and create a kind of a monoculturalism, and the other which is trying to pull away from it and saying, no, we want to be different. And then I think these are human forces at work, one which unifies.
So, one of the problems that we face, I guess, as activists is that, we are never in control of things. Sometimes events happen, movements happen, pressures happen, and the best we can do is try and frame our responses to it. And I'm going to go back to what you were saying about Ireland and the marriage referendum. A fascinating process. I mean, watching it, and in a sense, it is just up the stakes for marriage everywhere. Now Australia is facing it. Apparently, finally, Tony Abbott may give way and vote on marriage. And Australia's victory comes after a long series of defeats across the world over marriage, where marriage was seen as this hugely polarizing thing. A lot of gay activists have not been in favor of marriage. I mean, many people in India, and I probably would be one of them, who would say that we cannot talk about marriage until we have basic rights. So the arguments go both ways. Whether we like it or not, this issue of gay marriage is with us, is across the world. How should one respond to it?
And the point is that Australian society accepted same-sex couples before we moved, as we will inevitably, to legalising marriage. I think the basic point is legal change can only come along with social and cultural change. And there is a danger of pushing too hard too fast without changing attitudes. And the wonderful thing I want to say about something like Kashish is that it's actually addressing both. I mean, I've seen films that are very much based on this battle around 377, which has become, a global issue, because if India changes that law, that will have reverberations through all of the former empire countries that retain similar laws. But at the same time, the festival by its very nature is about changing ideas, changing attitudes, changing perceptions. And going back to marriage, my feeling is that marriage, the legalization of marriage will only come and be meaningful once there is general social acceptance of same-sex couples. And ironically, this is where I'm a cynic, because we already have this in Australia, quite honestly, I don't give a shit if we legalise it or not, because it actually will make very little real difference to anyone.
First queer South Asian marriages that I read about were those marriages that happened in California. I'm sure there were many in India too, but the ones that I remember reading about were. Do you think they made any difference?
Yes, it is that and it is that. Yes and no. In the sense you're right. Marriage has a whole cultural significance that is different, for the Indian American immigrants or the Indian immigrants in the US, marriage meant a whole different thing than it meant for the human rights campaign fighting for marriage equality in that country. And so the people who wanted to get married, you see these things now, and you see it in terms of the bride and the groom, and it's like the big fat Indian lesbian wedding and how elaborate and fancy and everything else. But the marriages that I went to in California, before they were legal, before it was put to vote, the entire thing, they had elaborately planned it, and they had wedding planners and everything. But the most moving part of the ceremony and everything was about the two fathers who came, and then they were doing their sangeet and their mehendi, they were mimicking the whole thing. But when the boy and his partner went to the father, who had flown in from India, and he blessed them, that's when everybody teared up. So in the end, it's not about marriage as much as about the right to marriage, as much as marriage being a way for the parent and the son to finally be able to come together in the same place where they could both understand each other in a relationship that had already been defined.
Before the legalization of gay marriage happened, around the same time in US, in Boston and so on. And I had interviewed about 40 people, and for most of them, when I asked them about what is your dream, it was exactly this. It wasn't mimicking a Western idea of we want gay marriage rights. It was mimicking a heteronormative Indian ideal, which is super romantic, which perhaps Yash Chopra and his predecessors have instilled enough, but which is still very valid, which was exactly, in a sense, what Harish and their mom and their dad did. It said that I want to live with someone, I want to find someone, I want to bring them home, I want our parents to give us away, and I want to either live in my home or his parents might be old. So I don't think this desire is global. I think it's particular.
India did not have marriage laws. Marriage laws came with time. We assume that today we're talking in terms of monogamy, but marriages about 100 years ago, there were polygamous marriages, especially amongst the affluent people. So when the laws came, the idea of monogamy also came with it. And one of the reasons you have, if you talk to a lawyer who will be expert in this, why you have marriage laws which are different from Hindus, Muslims, and different religious groups. So we don't realize that laws come with their own restrictions, they take away freedom, they give opportunities, but essentially marriage is about property. It is about resources. It is about wealth and transmission of wealth. What you are talking about is what you were talking about is sanskar. Sanskar is experience and relationships. It has nothing to do with the law. So rites of passage, relationships have nothing to do with the law. In India, we know that there is justice and there is the law. If you start taking the law too seriously, every time you read the newspapers, your heart sinks, right? The court doesn't give you the kind of confidence it should give you. So you create your world within your worlds, with your families, with your friends. You figure out the jugaad is because there is no great state which is being fair and just to all. It's being fair and just to a few, very conveniently. And that's the world we live in. That doesn't mean we'll stop living, right? Relationships will continue to form, rituals will continue to take place. It may happen within closed doors, openly, within the media glare outside. But the fact is, people are going to have their relationships, whether you like it or not. Parents are going to accept their gay children, parents are going to reject their gay children, laws notwithstanding, because it is about human beings.
David is right. Life continues. Law, the Supreme Court may have turned us down. Yet here all of us are here at an openly gay, gay and lesbian film festival, happening openly in Bombay, in Liberty, one of the oldest and most beautiful theatres in the city. So I think that is something positive to take forward. Now let me just throw any questions from the audience. I'm David in particular, because David has to leave like in 10 minutes.
David, you said something about that how people try to box. Whether it's sexuality or some gender, everything. But don't you think for a queer movement to move forward, we need those boxes?
I think boxes are a dangerous thing because they confine. And if you're talking about a queer movement, we're talking about liberation. So it's ironical that we have to box ourselves in order to liberate ourselves. I think it is difficult to think fluid. It is difficult because with an Excel sheet is always more comfortable than a PowerPoint presentation, right, in business world. Because numbers make us feel comfortable. They sort of put things in order, but they are not, it's not reality. The elements are there for our convenience, for the scientist's convenience. But in nature, there is no such concept as a periodic table. It's what humans have constructed to control nature. The human mind will always defy because what I knew about myself 10 years ago is not what I am today, and I don't know where I'll be 10 years from today. So I don't know if there's a box out there already towards which I'm moving. So it's like words. Words are confining, but really our thoughts are fluid, and therefore just writing prose doesn't communicate love. Sometimes you need to write poetry, breaking rules of grammar. And sometimes even words are not good enough, and therefore you create art, or just a gesture, or just a sigh, which will communicate so much more than a word. So I think we should understand that fluidity is the human condition, while boxes are necessary for communication, but it's only functional, it's of no other value.
Can I differ with you on this and say, yes, at an emotional level, certainly, but if we were to take this line of thinking, then perhaps we wouldn't move anywhere in terms of our legal rights. And I think Sakshi's question in that is, if we have to make these baby steps forward, knowing fully well that it is limiting, what can we align around?
The thing is, when I'm saying fluid, you are hearing stagnant. Because you're saying, how do we move forward? Because fluidity is about movement, and not necessarily movement forwards, it can also move backwards. The idea of either or itself is a box. Why can't it be and? Especially in a country like India, where there is so much diversity that you'll only have ands. You will always have via medias. We are a land of via media. We are always a land of possibilities.
The fact that the Nalsa judgment came after the rejection was like, that's and. So we're rejecting you and we're also accepting you. It's like everything.
I've been telling people that I've been working on the Bhagavad Gita for the last several months now. And one of the things that I always observe is Arjun keeps saying, give me a clear answer, A or B. And Krishna says, A is very good, B is not bad. Actually, B is A and A is B and there is also a C. That's God talking to you.
Yeah, but we want the judges to talk to us also.
The Supreme Court to give us A and not B.
No, I don't think the Supreme Court judgment, as they spoke of South Africa, while that's a good milestone, laws don't make people happy. Laws are just laws.
Which is exactly Dennis's point. The South Africa, the judgment came from the courts and has not trickled down.
It's important, but not necessary.
So what about new narratives beyond the coming out narrative and how we represent that in our culture? What are your thoughts on that, so that we don't look at it as something extravagant or out there, but as just something normal?
Well, every relationship is a narrative, effectively, right? And what is a relationship? It's two people discovering themselves in different ways. And if you look at any relationship of yours, it's actually a narrative. And there are days when it moves forward, then one day you discover something about them that you may or may not like. They will discover something about you that you may or may not like. You're seeking something reflective of you in them. And I think that conversation, the word for it is yagya, where you give and you receive, where you give and you receive constantly. This is another way of looking at narratives, where it's only about, there is no great climax. See, the heroic narrative has this climax, that once you say it, it ends. That's where the happy ending, that's where the concept of fairy tale comes from.
Yeah. There's a question from the back. Please, somebody take the mic.
I was going to answer the point about fluidity and boxes. I mean, I think you made a really important point. Boxes or claiming identities is a necessary political act, as long as we remember it is also an imagined act, and that many people don't have fixed identities. And this is not about my talking out of my experience or your experience. It is actually talking out of 150 years of sexological research. And my view of sexuality goes back to both Freud and Kinsey. And we have huge empirical evidence that people's sexuality, and indeed their gender expression, is much more fluid than the term LGBT, whatever it is today. It's probably today LGBTIQAA, and another letter was added while we had lunch. That is a myth. Human beings are much more diverse and fluid than we are allowed to be.
Some of us are.
No, human beings. I agree. I'm a gay man. Okay, I think it would be very unlikely, but not impossible. When I came here on Singapore Airlines, ironically, because in Singapore what we do is illegal, I saw a French gay film, in which the story was a gay man in a gay relationship who suddenly, unexpectedly, and to his total surprise and indeed dismay, falls in love with a woman. We cannot say that is not possible for us.
Is it common?
It is much more common, interesting for women than for men. And that's actually, we have empirical research about that.
Why are we still talking about the legal benefits and legal rights being linked with marriage? Can't we talk about legal benefits and legal rights without getting into the institution of marriage?
I actually agree with you, and I think it's a bit like the answer about boxes. I think we're now at a stage in global history where same-sex marriage has become such a symbolic way of saying we accept sexual diversity, we accept homosexuality, that actually, despite all my reservations, I'm strongly supportive of it. Now, marriage has become a symbolic issue, but at the same time, it does not solve the problems of social acceptance.
Why does it have to be either or?
It doesn't. Exactly.
Ideal world,
Yeah.
the way
It doesn't have to be either or. I mean, I think some of us are just reacting to the fact that there is such an overwhelming discourse of marriage that it tends to push aside other issues exactly like what you were talking about. I mean, currently at least it seems to me marriage is becoming a dominating issue, which to me, I'm sorry Ankit, and people who are strong proponents of marriage, seems to me a bit unbalanced.
No, so it doesn't have to be either or, but when you live in a heteronormative, misogynist world in which you're trying to fight for your rights, it helps in simplifying things. And what marriage has done very usefully all around the world, including most recently in Ireland, is help straight society.
Yes.
Some might argue that straight society is not as intelligent and cannot deal with as much complexity. So if you tell straight society, why would it be either or? You might confuse them. So treat them with compassion. So overwhelming straight majority heterosexual society, which has courts, which has laws, which make these rules that we want to fight against. Things like marriage really help. If you can gather around it, it helps in simplifying stuff. Obviously in an ideal world, there would be diversity, we would accept difference of all kinds, and but I think in the world in which we live in, which is not ideal and which is very unequal, things like marriage help you galvanize around a very simple issue.
What worries me about this discourse, whether it's in India or in the West, is that it further marginalizes people who are not in long-term relationships. And I have had people come to me in tears when I've been critical of marriage, precisely because they feel worthless because they're not in a long-term relationship. And I think this is why I deliberately made that comment about the Kashish film. I think there is something wonderful and moving about the idea that everyone will find someone and live happily ever after. But at the same time, the other side of that is, what does it do to the people who haven't? And that we have to bear in mind in this exuberance and excitement that everybody is going to get married and walk off into the sunset, because we're not.
Historically, actually, we have had extended families. We have had all these structures which go beyond families. I mean, some people call them like, we're using for terms, you call them like, orders of, monks or people like that. All these non-family structures have always existed. And perhaps, I mean, this is something that people like Ashok have talked about in the past, that maybe the solution for the queer people, and actually non-married people of all time, because there's heterosexual non-married people too, is that we need to look beyond the nuclear families to these other structures.